The sound of wheelchair wheels on marble echoed through the Manhattan boardroom like a countdown timer. Victoria Sterling tapped once on the polished table. 47 executives waited for her verdict on the billion-dollar deal. "No," she said, her voice cold as ice. Across the city, Ethan Blackwood, a single father who built an empire from the ruins of a broken marriage, stood on the 60th floor, watching a skyscraper rise. 7-year-old Lucas pressed his face against the window, drawing hearts with small fingers on the condensation. "Daddy," Lucas whispered, "can I have dinner with you tonight?" Ethan looked at his son tenderly. "Of course, sweetheart." In 3 hours, he would have a date with a woman he believed had no reason to betray or fall in love with him, but was incredibly valuable to the empire he stood upon. The most powerful disabled woman in Manhattan had just agreed to his business dinner. She hadn't been seen smiling in so long, not for billion-dollar deals or prestigious business awards. Would she give him a fake smile tonight? The executive who had just pitched the merger shuffled his papers with trembling hands, sweat beading on his forehead despite the perfectly controlled climate of Sterling Media Group's boardroom. Victoria Sterling's single word had just cost his firm 3 months of preparation and millions in potential revenue. But she didn't spare him another glance. Her attention had already shifted to the envelope her assistant placed beside her water glass. Cream-colored paper, expensive weight, the kind used for formal invitations that couldn't be ignored. Victoria's fingers traced the edge of the envelope without opening it. She had built Sterling Media from the ground up after her uncle's death, transforming a modest newspaper chain into a multimedia empire that reached every corner of American culture. 23 years in a wheelchair hadn't slowed her down. If anything, it had sharpened her focus to a razor's edge. People underestimated her once. They never made that mistake twice. The boardroom slowly emptied as executives filed out, their conversations hushed and cautious. Victoria remained motionless, studying the envelope as if it might reveal its contents through sheer will. Invitations to charity galas, business dinners, and industry awards arrived daily. She declined most, attended others as duty demanded, but never, not once in 15 years, had she accepted anything that resembled a personal invitation. The last man who had asked her to dinner had been gently but firmly redirected to a professional lunch, with her assistant present and an agenda printed in advance. She opened the envelope with deliberate precision, the way she approached everything in her life. The invitation was simple, direct, and utterly unexpected. Ethan Blackwood, CEO of Blackwood Construction, requested the pleasure of her company for dinner. Not a business lunch, not a charity function. Dinner. The audacity of it should have annoyed her. Instead, she found herself reading it twice, then a third time, searching for the angle, the hidden agenda, the business proposition disguised as social courtesy. But there was none. Just an invitation, a time, a place, and a phone number written in his own hand at the bottom. Victoria set the paper down and reached for her tablet, pulling up Blackwood Construction's profile with practiced efficiency. Ethan Blackwood, 39 years old, divorced 3 years ago, sole custody of 1 child. His company had built half of Manhattan's skyline in the past decade, including the building where she now sat. Their paths had crossed at industry events, brief handshakes, and polite exchanges. Nothing more. He had never given any indication of personal interest, never lingered in conversation, never asked for more than professional courtesy. Victoria's assistant appeared in the doorway, tablet in hand, ready to discuss the afternoon's schedule. But Victoria held up one finger, still staring at the invitation. For reasons she couldn't articulate, something about Ethan Blackwood's straightforward request intrigued her. Perhaps it was the lack of pretense, or the fact that he hadn't mentioned business once in 3 lines of text. Or perhaps, she admitted to herself with reluctant honesty, it was the simple fact that he had asked at all. She had learned to read people the way architects read blueprints, studying the foundation, identifying weak points, predicting where cracks might appear under pressure. Ethan Blackwood's reputation was solid, his business dealings transparent, his personal life notably quiet since his divorce. Men in his position typically remarried quickly, trading their ex-wives for younger models with strategic precision. He hadn't. In 3 years, he had been photographed at exactly 2 social events, both related to his son's school. The tabloids had eventually given up trying to link him romantically to anyone. Victoria picked up her phone and dialed the number written at the bottom of the invitation. It rang once, twice, then his voice answered, deeper than she remembered from their brief professional encounters. "Blackwood. Mr. Blackwood, this is Victoria Sterling. I received your invitation." She kept her voice neutral, businesslike, giving nothing away. "Ms. Sterling, I wasn't sure you'd call." There was something in his tone, not surprise exactly, but a careful wariness that she recognized. It was the sound of someone who had learned not to expect too much. "I rarely accept social invitations." She paused, then added, "But I find myself curious about your motivations." "My motivations are simple," he said, and she could hear traffic in the background, the distant sound of construction. He was at a job site, she realized, conducting business from the middle of concrete and steel. "You're intelligent, you understand the pressures of running a company, and you're not looking for anything I can't give." It seemed like a conversation worth having. The honesty in his statement caught her off guard. Most men approached her with either pity or fascination, poor little rich girl in a wheelchair, or the curiosity of those who wanted to understand how she had accumulated so much power despite her disability. Ethan's assessment was purely practical, almost clinical in its directness. "You're not looking for anything I can't give." The phrase echoed in her mind, and she realized he was right. She wasn't looking for romance, for marriage, for the complications that came with emotional entanglement. She had stopped believing in those possibilities long ago. 8 o'clock. She found herself asking. "Le Bernardin. I'll make the reservation." He paused, then added, "Ms. Sterling, thank you." The line went dead before she could respond. Victoria stared at her phone for a long moment, wondering what she had just agreed to, and why the prospect of dinner with Ethan Blackwood felt like stepping off a cliff she hadn't realized she'd been standing on. Across the city, Ethan closed his phone and looked up at the skeleton of steel rising before him. The construction site hummed with activity, welders sending sparks cascading down 40 floors, crane operators maneuvering beams with millimeter precision, foremen shouting orders that somehow made sense over the chaos of industrial noise. This was his world. Concrete and steel, problems that could be solved with engineering and determination. Building upward, always upward, creating something lasting from raw materials and sheer will. His foreman approached, hard hat tilted at an angle that suggested either confidence or casual disregard for safety regulations. "Boss, we need to talk about the foundation pour on the east side. The concrete's setting faster than we calculated." Ethan nodded, his mind already shifting to the technical problem at hand, but part of his attention remained fixed on the phone call he had just finished. Victoria Sterling had said yes. He hadn't expected that, hadn't planned for it, hadn't allowed himself to hope for it. The invitation had been sent on impulse, a moment of uncharacteristic spontaneity that he had regretted almost immediately. But she had called, and she had agreed. And now he had 6 hours to remember how to conduct himself at a dinner that wasn't a business meeting. Lucas would need to be picked up from school, fed, and settled with his homework before 8. Mrs. Alvarez, the elderly woman who lived in the apartment next door, had agreed to stay with him for the evening. She was the only babysitter Lucas tolerated, possibly because she challenged him to chess games he actually had to think about winning. Ethan made a mental note to stop by the grocery store for the specific brand of ice cream Lucas would demand as payment for good behavior. The foundation pour required his attention for the next 2 hours, a complex choreography of timing and engineering that couldn't be delegated. But even as he directed the crews and monitored the concrete mixture, his thoughts kept returning to Victoria Sterling's voice on the phone. There had been something in her tone when she asked about his motivations. Not suspicion, exactly, but a careful probing that suggested she was accustomed to people wanting something from her. The realization struck him that perhaps they were more alike than he had initially thought. His ex-wife had wanted things. The lifestyle, the prestige, the social connections that came with being married to a successful businessman. She had tolerated his long hours and his dedication to his work as long as the benefits outweighed the inconvenience. But when Lucas was born, when Ethan's priorities shifted to include someone who needed him more than she did, her patience had evaporated. The affairs had started 6 months after Lucas's birth, small betrayals at first, then larger ones, until the foundation of their marriage had cracked beyond repair. He had learned, in the aftermath of divorce papers and custody battles, that trust was like structural engineering. Once the load-bearing elements failed, the entire structure became unstable. Better to build carefully from the beginning than to attempt repairs on a compromised foundation. Victoria Sterling, from what he knew of her reputation and her carefully controlled public image, seemed to understand that principle. She had built her empire methodically, without relying on partnerships that might prove unreliable. She was, in every sense that mattered, self-sufficient. The concrete pour finished without complications, and Ethan spent the remaining daylight hours reviewing blueprints and coordinating with subcontractors. By the time he picked up Lucas from school, his mind had shifted to the logistics of the evening ahead. Lucas climbed into the passenger seat of the pickup truck, backpack trailing papers and the lingering scent of elementary school cafeteria food. "Dad, Tommy Alvarez says his grandmother is coming over tonight to beat you at chess," Lucas announced, buckling his seatbelt with the serious concentration he applied to most tasks. "Mrs. Alvarez is babysitting, not playing chess with me," Ethan corrected, though he smiled at the mental image of the 70-year-old woman defeating him at anything requiring strategy. "Where are you going?" Lucas asked, and Ethan heard genuine curiosity in his son's voice, not accusation. In 3 years, Ethan had left Lucas with a babysitter exactly 4 times, and 3 of those had been for parent-teacher conferences that couldn't be rescheduled. "Business dinner," Ethan said, which was true enough. He had spent the afternoon convincing himself that his interest in Victoria Sterling was purely professional, a potential collaboration between 2 companies that could benefit from strategic alignment. The fact that she intrigued him on a personal level was irrelevant, or at least manageable. Lucas accepted this explanation without question, his attention already shifting to the homework assignment that would determine whether he earned screen time before bed. Ethan listened to his son's detailed explanation of the solar system project due next week, offering suggestions about cardboard and paint, while his mind wandered to the conversation he would have in 3 hours with a woman who had agreed to dinner for reasons he didn't entirely understand. The restaurant was exactly what he had expected. Elegant, without being ostentatious. The kind of place where serious conversations happened over carefully prepared food. Victoria arrived precisely at 8, her assistant wheeling her to the table Ethan had specifically requested, near the back of the dining room, away from curious eyes and potential interruptions. She wore a navy blue dress that complemented her dark hair, and her eyes, he noticed for the first time, were the color of storm clouds just before lightning struck. "Miss Sterling." He stood as she approached, a gesture of respect that seemed to catch her off guard. "Mr. Blackwood," she replied, and he noticed how she positioned her wheelchair at a slight angle to the table, maintaining clear sightlines to the entrance and the rest of the restaurant. It was the unconscious positioning of someone accustomed to being watched, evaluated, potentially threatened. He filed the observation away and took his seat across from her. The initial conversation was safe, predictable. Industry trends, economic forecasts, the kind of professional small talk that filled the spaces between more meaningful exchanges. But as the evening progressed, Ethan found himself genuinely interested in her perspectives on urban development and media influence on public policy. Victoria Sterling was not just intelligent, she was incisive, cutting through pretense and conventional wisdom with observations that revealed a mind unafraid of challenging accepted truths. "You don't agree with the mayor's infrastructure proposal," she said over the appetizer course, and it wasn't a question. "The timeline is unrealistic, and the budget is understated by at least 30%, Ethan replied. "But more importantly, the plan doesn't account for the neighborhoods that will be displaced by the construction. Good infrastructure shouldn't come at the cost of community stability." Victoria studied him with renewed interest. That's an unusual perspective from someone who profits from large-scale construction projects. "Profitable work that destroys communities isn't sustainable," he said simply. "Eventually you run out of places to build." They talked until the restaurant began preparing for closing, neither of them noticing the passage of time or the gradual emptying of the dining room around them. When Victoria finally glanced at her watch, surprise flickered across her features, the first unguarded expression he had seen from her all evening. "I should go," she said, and he heard reluctance in her voice that matched his own. "Thank you for accepting the invitation," Ethan said as he stood to leave. "I hope we can do this again." Victoria looked up at him for a long moment, and he had the distinct impression she was making some kind of internal calculation. "Yes," she said finally. "I think we should." As her assistant wheeled her toward the exit, Ethan remained standing by their table, watching her navigate the restaurant with the same focused determination she probably applied to running her company. He realized he was looking forward to their next conversation in a way that had nothing to do with business opportunities and everything to do with the unexpected discovery that Victoria Sterling was exactly as intelligent and complicated as he had hoped she would be. The evening had exceeded his carefully managed expectations, and that fact should have worried him more than it did. Instead, he found himself wondering what other assumptions about Victoria Sterling, and about himself, might prove to be incomplete. The thought followed him home, where Mrs. Alvarez reported that Lucas had finished his homework, eaten his vegetables, and won 2 games of chess before admitting he was tired enough for bed. Ethan checked on his sleeping son, then sat in his home office reviewing the day's construction reports. But his concentration kept drifting to the memory of Victoria's laugh when he had described Lucas's latest attempt to negotiate a later bedtime through the strategic application of mathematical logic. She had laughed, actually laughed, and the sound had been nothing like the carefully controlled responses he had expected from Manhattan's most formidable media executive. Perhaps, he thought, as he finally turned off the lights and headed to bed, some foundations were stronger than they appeared from the outside, and perhaps, after 3 years of careful isolation, he was ready to test that theory. The phone call came the next morning while Ethan was reviewing blueprints over his first cup of coffee. Victoria's voice was crisp, professional, but he detected something underneath the business tone, a warmth that hadn't been there during their previous conversations. "Mr. Blackwood, I have a proposition for you," she said without preamble. "I'm listening." "I'm hosting a charity gala next month for children's mobility research. I need someone to coordinate the venue logistics. Your company has experience with event management for large-scale gatherings." Ethan set down his coffee cup, recognizing the offer for what it was, an excuse for continued interaction disguised as a business opportunity. "What did you have in mind?" "A partnership," Victoria said, and he heard the slight emphasis she placed on the word. "Professional collaboration with the potential for expanded scope." The phrase hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither of them was quite ready to articulate directly. Ethan found himself smiling, appreciating both her caution and her directness. "I think Blackwood Construction could be very interested in that kind of partnership," he said. "When can we schedule a planning meeting?" "Tomorrow afternoon. My office." She paused, then added, And Mr. Blackwood? Bring your son. I have a feeling this project might benefit from a 7-year-old's perspective on accessibility. The line went dead before he could respond, leaving Ethan staring at his phone with the growing realization that Victoria Sterling was far more perceptive and far more interesting than he had initially calculated. She had noticed his mention of Lucas the previous evening, remembered it, and found a way to include his son in their professional collaboration. It was a gesture that spoke to an understanding of his priorities that few people, particularly in his business circles, had ever demonstrated. Lucas, when informed that he would be attending a business meeting at Sterling Media Group, reacted with the kind of excitement typically reserved for trips to amusement parks or ice cream stores. His enthusiasm was infectious, and Ethan found himself looking forward to the meeting with an anticipation that had nothing to do with potential revenue and everything to do with the prospect of seeing how Victoria Sterling interacted with his son. The Sterling Media Building occupied an entire city block, its glass and steel facade reflecting the afternoon sun like a crystal prism. Lucas pressed his face against the truck window as they approached, counting floors and pointing out architectural details with the focused attention he applied to everything that captured his interest. Ethan parked in the visitor section of the underground garage, noting the accessibility features that had been built into the structure's design: wider spaces, lower elevator buttons, ramps that curved at gentle angles rather than sharp inclines. The elevator to the executive floor was spacious enough to accommodate wheelchairs, and Ethan realized that Victoria's office building had been designed with her needs in mind, not retrofitted as an afterthought. The attention to detail spoke to both practical necessity and a refusal to accept limitations imposed by others' assumptions about what was possible. Victoria's assistant greeted them in the reception area, a woman in her 50s, whose warm smile and gentle manner with Lucas suggested she had experience with children. She led them through a series of corridors lined with awards, newspaper clippings, and photographs that documented Sterling Media's growth from a small newspaper chain to a multimedia empire. Lucas studied each display with serious concentration, occasionally asking questions that revealed his understanding of business concepts most 7-year-olds never encountered. Victoria's office occupied the corner of the building, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Manhattan that included several buildings Ethan's company had constructed. She was reviewing documents when they entered, but looked up immediately, her attention focusing on Lucas with genuine interest, rather than the polite tolerance most adults showed when children appeared in professional settings. "You must be Lucas," she said, and Ethan noticed how she positioned her wheelchair to be at eye level with his son, rather than looking down at him. "Your father tells me you're an expert on solar systems." Lucas straightened with pride, launching into a detailed explanation of his school project that included specifications for planet sizes, orbital distances, and the optimal materials for creating a 3-dimensional model. Victoria listened with the same focused attention she had given Ethan's opinions on infrastructure development, asking questions that demonstrated genuine interest and understanding of the subject matter. "I have a conference room with a large table where you could work on your project while your father and I discuss business," she offered when Lucas finished his explanation. "Would that be acceptable?" Lucas nodded enthusiastically, and Victoria's assistant appeared with art supplies and reference books about space exploration that she had apparently prepared in advance. The level of preparation impressed Ethan, suggesting that Victoria had given considerable thought to making Lucas comfortable in an environment designed for adult professionals. The business discussion that followed was both more complex and more personal than Ethan had anticipated. Victoria outlined her vision for the charity gala with the same strategic precision she probably applied to media acquisitions, but her passion for the cause was evident in every detail. The research foundation she supported focused on developing new technologies for children with mobility limitations, funding that could lead to innovations benefiting thousands of young people facing challenges similar to those Victoria had overcome. "I was 12 when the accident happened," she said without preamble, watching Ethan's face for his reaction. A drunk driver hit our car during a family vacation. My parents died instantly. I spent the next 6 months learning how to navigate a world designed for people who walk. The matter-of-fact delivery of this information didn't diminish its impact. Ethan found himself understanding, for the first time, the source of Victoria's carefully controlled demeanor and her reluctance to trust easily. She had learned at 12 years old that life could change irreversibly in an instant, that the people you depended on could disappear without warning, that survival required self-reliance above all else. "Your uncle raised you," Ethan said, remembering what he had read in her company's biography. "He taught me that disability is often just a failure of imagination." Victoria replied, "Most barriers exist because no one has bothered to design around them. When I took over Sterling Media, my first priority was proving that point." Their conversation was interrupted by Lucas's excited voice from the conference room, where he was apparently explaining his planet placement strategy to Victoria's assistant. The sound of his son's laughter echoed down the hallway, and Ethan realized it had been months since he had heard Lucas so animated around adults outside their small circle of neighbors and teachers. "He's comfortable here," Victoria observed, following Ethan's gaze toward the conference room. "He doesn't usually warm up to new people this quickly." Ethan admitted, "You've been very kind to him." "Kindness has nothing to do with it," Victoria said with a slight smile. "He's intelligent, curious, and he asks better questions than most of my board members. Besides, if we're going to work together, he should feel welcome in this environment." The phrase "work together" carried implications that extended beyond the charity gala, and both of them recognized it. They spent the next hour discussing logistics, timelines, and budget considerations, but underneath the professional planning, Ethan sensed a deeper conversation taking place. Victoria was testing him, evaluating his reliability, his understanding of her priorities, his capacity for the kind of partnership that might extend beyond business arrangements. When the meeting concluded, Lucas proudly displayed his partially completed solar system model, explaining to Victoria how he had calculated the relative sizes of the planets using a mathematical formula he had developed himself. Victoria examined his work with the same serious attention she had given the gala planning documents, offering suggestions that revealed her own understanding of spatial relationships and engineering principles. "Lucas," she said as they prepared to leave, "would you be interested in visiting the construction site for the new children's hospital your father's company is building? I'm thinking of doing a news story about accessible design in medical facilities." Lucas's eyes widened with excitement, and he looked to his father for permission. Ethan nodded, recognizing that Victoria was offering more than a simple field trip. She was including Lucas in their professional relationship, acknowledging his presence as more than an inconvenience to be tolerated during business meetings. As they rode the elevator down to the parking garage, Lucas chatted enthusiastically about planets, construction sites, and the possibility of appearing in a news story about his father's work. Ethan listened to his son's excitement while processing the afternoon's revelations about Victoria Sterling, her tragic childhood, her determination to transform obstacles into opportunities, her unexpected warmth toward Lucas despite her reputation for professional distance. The realization struck him that Victoria Sterling was nothing like the women who had pursued him since his divorce, women who saw Lucas as an obstacle to overcome or a responsibility to accept. She had welcomed his son as naturally as she had negotiated the terms of their business partnership, without fanfare or apparent effort. The gesture suggested a generosity of spirit that didn't match her carefully controlled public image, and Ethan found himself wondering what other assumptions about Victoria might prove to be incomplete. That evening, while Lucas worked on his homework at the kitchen table, Ethan found himself thinking about the way Victoria had listened to his son's explanations, the genuine interest she had shown in Lucas's perspective, the careful way she had positioned herself to be at his eye level during their conversation. Most adults, when confronted with an energetic 7-year-old in a professional setting, alternated between condescension and barely concealed impatience. Victoria had treated Lucas as an individual worthy of respect and attention, and the effect on his son had been immediately visible. "Dad," Lucas said, looking up from his mathematics workbook, "Ms. Sterling is really smart." "Yes, she is," Ethan agreed. "And she has a really cool office," Lucas continued, "with books about space and engineering and stuff that's actually interesting." "Did you like meeting her?" Lucas considered the question with his characteristic seriousness. "She talks to me like I'm a person, not like I'm just a kid who doesn't understand things. Most grown-ups do that thing where they use baby voices and ask stupid questions. She asked me real questions about my project." The observation was perceptive, and Ethan realized his son had identified something he hadn't consciously noticed. Victoria had indeed spoken to Lucas as an equal, adjusting her vocabulary without condescending, showing interest without pretending to be something she wasn't. The interaction had been authentic in a way that most adult-child conversations were not, and Lucas had responded to that authenticity with his characteristic enthusiasm for people who took him seriously. "Do you think we'll see her again?" Lucas asked, and Ethan heard hope in his son's voice that matched his own complicated feelings about Victoria Sterling. "I think we will," Ethan said, and meant it. The charity gala planning consumed the next 3 weeks, requiring daily phone calls, site visits, and coordination meetings that gradually shifted from professional necessity to something approaching personal routine. Victoria's attention to detail matched Ethan's own perfectionist tendencies, and their collaboration developed a rhythm that felt both efficient and comfortable. She consulted him on accessibility requirements for the venue. He sought her input on aesthetic elements that would photograph well for media coverage, and somehow their professional partnership began to feel like something more substantial than a business arrangement. Lucas accompanied them to several planning sessions, his presence becoming so natural that Victoria's assistant automatically prepared art supplies and reference materials whenever the Blackwood men were scheduled to visit. During these meetings, Ethan observed how Victoria interacted with his son, answering his questions with patience and genuine interest, involving him in decision-making processes when appropriate, treating him as a valued contributor rather than a tolerated presence. The realization that he was falling in love with Victoria Sterling arrived gradually, then suddenly, like the morning he watched her explain architectural principles to Lucas, using his solar system model as a 3-dimensional example. She had wheeled her chair closer to the conference table, pointing out how structural supports worked like gravitational forces to maintain stability, and Lucas had listened with rapt attention, asking questions that revealed his growing understanding of both astronomy and engineering. Ethan found himself studying Victoria's profile as she spoke, noting the way her eyes lit up when Lucas grasped a particularly complex concept, the genuine warmth in her smile when his son made connections between seemingly unrelated ideas. This was not the carefully controlled media executive who had built an empire through strategic determination. This was a woman who delighted in intellectual curiosity, who took pleasure in nurturing understanding, who had somehow found space in her carefully ordered life for a 7-year-old boy's enthusiastic questions about planets and buildings. The moment of recognition should have terrified him. Instead, Ethan felt something settle into place, like a structural beam finding its designated position in a framework designed to last. Victoria Sterling was not a safe choice, not a simple solution to the complications of single parenthood, not a woman who would settle for anything less than complete honesty. But she was, he realized, exactly the kind of person he wanted in his life, and in Lucas's life, regardless of the risks involved. The charity gala exceeded even Victoria's ambitious expectations. The venue, a renovated warehouse that Blackwood Construction had transformed into an elegant event space, accommodated wheelchairs, walkers, and other mobility devices, with seamless integration that made accessibility invisible rather than obvious. The evening raised more money for children's mobility research than any previous Sterling Media charity event. But more importantly, it demonstrated what was possible when universal design principles were applied with creativity rather than mere compliance. Ethan watched Victoria work the room throughout the evening, gracefully navigating conversations with donors, politicians, and media representatives who had come to support the cause. She was magnificent in her element, confident, articulate, completely in control of every detail. But he also noticed the moments when her professional mask slipped slightly, revealing the genuine emotion behind her advocacy for children facing the kinds of challenges she had overcome. Lucas, dressed in his first formal suit and armed with extensive coaching about proper behavior at adult events, proved to be an unexpected ambassador for the Foundation's mission. His natural curiosity about the assistive technologies on display led to conversations with other young attendees, and soon he was conducting impromptu tours of the adaptive equipment exhibit with the enthusiasm of someone who had found his calling as a junior educator. "Your son is remarkable," Victoria said during a brief lull in her hostess duties, watching Lucas demonstrate a prototype wheelchair design to a group of fascinated adults. "He gets that from his mother," Ethan replied automatically, then caught himself. It was the first time he had mentioned his ex-wife in Victoria's presence, and he wasn't sure why the comment had emerged now. Victoria studied his face with the careful attention she applied to everything that interested her. "You don't talk about her." "There's not much to say," Ethan said, and realized it was true. The anger and betrayal that had consumed him during the divorce proceedings had faded into something closer to indifference. "She wanted things I couldn't provide, and I wanted things she couldn't understand. Sometimes people are just incompatible." "What did you want that she couldn't understand?" Victoria asked, and Ethan recognized the question as more than casual curiosity. He gestured toward Lucas, who was now explaining planetary orbital mechanics to a delighted elderly woman using hand gestures and sound effects. "I wanted to be the kind of father who shows up for school plays and science fair projects and bedtime stories. She wanted to be the kind of wife who attends charity galas and country club events and networking dinners. Those things aren't mutually exclusive, but they were for us." Victoria nodded slowly, and Ethan sensed she understood something about competing priorities and the difficulty of maintaining relationships when fundamental values diverged. Her own dedication to Sterling Media and her advocacy work left little room for the kind of social obligations that many women in her position considered essential. "Lucas is lucky to have you," she said quietly. "I'm lucky to have him," Ethan replied. "He makes everything else make sense." The conversation was interrupted by the master of ceremonies announcing the evening's final auction item. But something had shifted between them, a recognition of shared values that went deeper than professional compatibility or mutual attraction. They had both made choices that prioritized substance over appearance, meaning over convenience, and the acknowledgement of that common ground felt like the foundation for something more substantial than either had initially planned. The evening ended with Lucas asleep in a chair near the registration table, exhausted by his first experience as a junior philanthropist, but radiating satisfaction from a successful debut in adult society. Victoria insisted on personally ensuring their safe departure, accompanying them to the parking garage, despite her assistant's gentle suggestion that she had other obligations requiring attention. "Thank you," she said as Ethan transferred his sleeping son to the truck's passenger seat. "For everything. The venue, the planning, the execution. It was perfect." "Thank you for including Lucas," Ethan replied. "He's been talking about tonight for weeks. I think you've created a future advocate for accessibility research." Victoria smiled, and Ethan noticed it was the unguarded expression he had seen so rarely during their initial interactions. He asked me yesterday if disabilities make people more interesting. When I asked him what he meant, he said that you have to be creative when regular solutions don't work, and creative people usually have better ideas. The comment was so perfectly Lucas, perceptive, optimistic, and revealing of his ability to find unexpected insights in situations that confused most adults. Ethan felt a surge of pride in his son's emotional intelligence, coupled with gratitude that Victoria had taken the time to really listen to a 7-year-old's perspective on complex social issues. "He's not wrong," Ethan said. "Some of the most innovative solutions I've seen have come from people who couldn't use conventional approaches." "Is that why you agreed to work with me?" Victoria asked, and he heard genuine curiosity in her question rather than fishing for compliments. "I agreed to work with you because you're brilliant, effective, and completely unimpressed by things that don't matter," Ethan said honestly. "The fact that you've overcome significant challenges just makes those qualities more impressive." Victoria looked at him for a long moment, and Ethan had the sense she was making some kind of internal decision. "Ethan," she said, using his first name for the first time in their months of collaboration, "would you like to have dinner again? Not for business this time." The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications they had both been carefully avoiding. Ethan realized they had reached a crossroads that would determine whether their relationship remained professionally cordial or evolved into something more complex and potentially more meaningful. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "I would like that very much." "Good," Victoria replied, and her smile transformed her entire face, revealing the woman behind the carefully constructed professional image. "I'll call you tomorrow." As Ethan drove home through the quiet Manhattan streets, Lucas sleeping peacefully beside him, he found himself thinking about the evening's revelations. Victoria Sterling was not the safe, uncomplicated business partnership he had initially calculated. She was intelligent, passionate, fiercely independent, and completely unpredictable. Getting involved with her would mean accepting uncertainty, emotional risk, and the possibility of complications he couldn't control or anticipate. The prospect should have terrified him. Instead, Ethan felt something he hadn't experienced since Lucas's birth, the excitement of discovering something worth the risk of hoping for more than safety and predictability. Victoria Sterling was worth the risk, and for the first time in 3 years, he was ready to take it.